That's nice. Hello, hello. Okay, I'm on. Hi, everybody. Oh, it is amazing to have you here with us tonight. I realize these are my reading glasses, and if I look out at you with them on, everyone is very blurry, so let me take them off. Hello, we are so grateful to have you here with us in person and live, and for our online audience who rocks with us every event. We're really grateful to have you too. We do this programming not for us, but really for you. And so the center is really not anything without this audience. So we never take your presence for granted. I'm so happy about tonight's event, the History of Black Miami-Dade, Rendering Black, Queer, and Elder Populations Visible. And it is a lecture by Nadege Green, who is our distinguished writer, community activist in residence at the Center for Black Visual Culture for fall 2022. Can we please give her a hand? On behalf of everyone at the Center for Black Visual Culture at the Institute of African American Affairs here at NYU, we thank you for being here tonight for our final event of the semester. We are so pleased to have CBVC's distinguished writer and community activist, Nadege Green, present her work. Nadege's work centers the lived experiences of Black people in South Florida and is deeply rooted in history and first-person narratives. As a 2005 Young Arts winner in writing for creative nonfiction, Nadege's residency with us is part of our ongoing collaboration with Young Arts, and it reflects our mutual commitment to supporting emerging and mid-career artists of color. Young Arts identifies the most accomplished young artists in the visual, literary, and performing arts and provides them with creative and professional development throughout their careers. And we are thrilled to have them as our collaborating partner. I am Dr. Joan Morgan. I am the program director for the Center for Black Visual Culture here at the Institute of African American Affairs at NYU. A few thanks. Thank you all again and everyone who helped to make this event possible. I'd like to thank our founder and director, Dr. Deborah Willis, who couldn't be with us this evening, but is always with us because the center is her vision and her baby, and I'm absolutely honored to be able to help her to lead it. I'd like to thank Clarissa Santiago, our program manager, and I want to say a very special thank you to Clarissa because this is her last event with us and the center, and I know how much care she put into making sure that you guys had this beautiful spread and organizing this event. So Clarissa, thank you. I'm not sure where Sid is. Is she still downstairs? Okay, Sid Fulton, our administrative aide, who we can't really function without her either. Thank you to our graduate student workers, Emeka Ochiaga and Kira Joy Williams, who's sitting in the front. Our photographer, Terrence Jennings, who has been with us on so many journeys, literally around the world, right? Literally, like we global and we worldwide, for real. And NYU Media Services, thank you. Also, a huge thank you to our co-sponsors, Young Arts, the Department of Photography and Imaging, NYU Tisch School of the Arts, NYU's 370J Project, the Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity and Strategic Innovation, and the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality here at NYU. Social media. If you are not following us yet, please follow CBVC on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle at both places is at NYUCBVC, and that's at NYUCBVC. And you can always find out more information about what we do at NYUIAAA.org. That is NYUIAAA, that's AAA.org. So, a bit about the lecture and our speaker. This evening, Nadege is going to present some of her work on emerging history and storytelling, on her emerging history and storytelling platform, Black Miami-Dade. Black Miami-Dade uses a combination of ethnographic interviews and archival practices to herald the rich and often ignored history of Black Miami. A critical focus of this project is the rendering of Miami's Black queer populations, making them visible, part of which is an upcoming exhibit that's planned for 2023. This kind of archival reclamation and commitment to visibility comports with the CBVC's and IAAA's ongoing mission to not only do research, but to document and to celebrate the cultural and intellectual production of the Black diaspora, and to also interrogate how various archives and the development of visual technologies affect the construction of representations. So I'm gonna go off the head for a second here because Nadege's bio doesn't begin to do justice to what she means to me. I first met her when I was working with Young Arts as the writing director for the program, and she came in as one of our master teachers, and I literally was in awe, in absolute awe of not just her writing and her work and her commitment, her quiet and fierce commitment to the Miami community, but just, Nadege is so easy and so powerful with it. And there are very few people in the world that really walk like that. Real bad girls move in silence, you know, and when they speak, everyone listens. That's Nadege Green. So to have made this journey with her, to have gone from her being a master teacher at Young Arts to becoming my friend, to actually seeing the Black Miami-Dade project on Instagram was like, yo, what are you doing and why don't I know about it? And then her consenting to come and be our first Young Arts Center for Black Visual Culture Artists-in-Residence is so special. I just really could not think of a better person to kick off this collaboration. So that's the part that's not in the bio. So I'll read the bio part now. Nadege Green is a researcher, writer, and community historian that's based in Miami. Her work focuses on the lived experiences of Black people in South Florida. Her practice and approach to storytelling is deeply rooted in history and first-person narratives that explore and connect issues around race, culture, climate justice, and displacement. She is a senior media fellow with the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Innovation. And Nadege was the inaugural community scholar in residence at the University of Miami Center for Global Black Studies in 2021. Her reporting has appeared in The Atlantic, the Miami Herald, WNYC, and NPR. Nadege is also the editor of the anthology More Than What Happened, An Aftermath of Gun Violence in Miami, which was published by Jai Alai Books in November 2022 and available now. She is currently working on a history exhibit that will honor and spotlight Miami's Black LGBTQ+ community. The exhibit will be presented in spring of 2023. The talk this evening will be followed by time for Q&A from our audience. And with that, please help me welcome Nadege Green.
Thank you, Joan. I just whispered, you're not supposed to make the speaker cry before the talk. I'm not sure what's happening. Do I say okay to this? Okay. I was like, I don't know what that's about to open up. Okay. First, I want to start by saying thank you so much for everyone showing up here. You know, I'm from Miami. It's cold outside. We don't go outside when it's cold. So, and I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience of friends and humans who I know from Miami and from New York. So thank you all for being here online as well. First, I want to start with just situating us in Miami and talking about Miami in a way that you may not have seen before and visualizing Miami in a way that you may not have seen before, because the common imagery of Miami, when we think about what is most visible about this space, is it's very much a highly edited and marketed and tourism-focused version of Miami. That Miami is a place where you go to vacation. It is a place where you flee California to sell cryptocurrency by the bay. Not that it is a place of deep roots and history rooted in Blackness, when in fact, it is all of those things, right? When I come to talking about the Black history, not the cryptocurrency. And when I say Miami, and I want to situate Miami as being in the Deep South, because it is. And when I say the Deep South, I mean that in no way as a pejorative, in a way that the South can sometimes be used as a pejorative, but more within the vein of how historian Imani Perry describes the South in her book, South to America, which is to understand this country, to understand Blackness in this country, you have to understand the South. And Miami is in the South. And I think it's important to name that because a big part of why Miami, when we think of the South and the history of the South, Miami is not the first place you're going to think of. It barely registers, and for good reason, because Miami is really good at marketing, and so it has extricated itself as part of the Deep South, because then that would mean you would have to contend with all that means, especially for Black folks, and the Black folks who quite literally built the foundation of Miami. And so I just want to start with that, Black folks, we've been here in Miami. And this is an image of Miami circa 1880s, before it was even a city, before Miami was incorporated. Coconut Grove was one of the first settlements of the region, and there were Black people there. Right. I love this image of these beautiful Black girls with a parasol as a mom. They look clearly over it, right? Like, take this picture and let's go. And but it's just so sweet at the same time. I imagine that they are siblings. The record does not actually speak to their relationship to one another. But every time I come across this photo, I smile to see these little girls in their pretty dresses and a parasol. And this is another image of early Miami, 1890s. And these are Bahamians in early Miami, again in Coconut Grove, which was one of the first settlements in what would become the Miami region of Black folks, many of whom, again, built the foundation of what we know as modern Miami and made it possible. So Miami was founded in 1896. And part of the work that I'm doing around reclamation and being able to see the images of Miami and being able to share those images of Miami is also imagining us in the past, because there aren't visuals for everything. So in particular, when we talk about the founding of the city of Miami, Miami could not become a city without Black men. 44% of the people who signed the city's incorporation paper were Black men. And they were, and I think it's important to name them as the architects and builders of Miami's foundation as well, in a way that Black folks get erased. And the names we do know are the names of Henry Flagler, who built the railroad. We know Julia Tuttle, who, purchased the land of what would become Miami. We know the name of white businessmen who would become the early businessmen of Miami. But erased from a lot of Miami's history is the fact that almost half of the people who made it possible for Miami to become a city were Black men. And so I commissioned a local artist, Chris Friday, to make Black Miami history coloring pages, because I think it's an easy way to share that history. I don't think knowing our history has to be difficult, and to make it short and sweet. And you can print hundreds of these, right, and touch so many people to know this history. And so this is one of the coloring pages that's available on blackmiamidade.com. And Friday imagined, what these men would look like after the signing of the incorporation papers. Historically, they normally sit next to each other and sit for a photo. And so we imagined that in an illustrative way. And we wanted to make sure y'all knew they were Black. So hence the goatees and beards. You see y'all see it, right? But I think it was important to also visualize what that could look like. And when I say Black men built Miami, I quite literally mean that, right? So on the left here is a photo of a black man clearing out the mangroves for what would become Miami Beach, because it was all filled with palmetto bushes and mangroves, and in order to build the city, you first had to level it. This is pre-construction equipment, right? So these are the folks who made that possible. And on the right are black men working on downtown Miami on the streets, road work. And so when we say builders and founders and architects of Miami, I mean that quite literally. When the incorporation papers were signed, on the left is one of the buildings, the lobby pool room where the incorporation papers were signed. On the right is another commissioned piece by Chris Friday for Black Miami-Dade, where we put front and center who signed the incorporation papers. Miami City's incorporation papers, on the very first line of the signatures, it's that of a black man. His name is Silas Austin. And so if you were to go pick up the historical record of Miami's charter, you would see Silas Austin's name as the first name signed on that charter. And so we reimagined that as a coloring page that you're looking at on the right. And so when we talk about Miami becoming a city, we know that black votes were important for that to happen, particularly black male votes, because women could not vote at the time. And because of the black vote being so important, it's also a threat. And so we saw in Miami what we saw in much of the South, what happens when black people can vote and are free to vote. In my personal collection is a Life magazine from 1939. These are images from that Life magazine that made national news. 1939 is a very important year in Florida history because a year prior is when the poll tax was lifted. So prior to 1939, in Miami's municipal elections, the most amount of votes ever cast by black people was 50. Because having a poll tax meant that it kept people from voting, because if you could not afford that poll tax, you could not vote, right? And so once that poll tax was lifted, the white power structure understood the real threat around black folks going to vote. And so the Klan rode through Miami's Overtown community, back then called Color Town. And this is a real photo of the Klan in Overtown in 1939. You see a man with a noose hanging outside of his window. You see this effigy with the epithet on it of, you know, picturing, right, like what would happen to you if you vote, because this was a very real threat. Not pictured the 25 crosses that were also burned in the neighborhood. And I think it's important, again, when we talk about Miami as being a site of the Deep South, we have to recognize white terrorism. And within that, the very real threat for black voters was not make-believe. In fact, if we looked at lynchings per capita in the entire South, Florida leads the entire South of lynchings of black people per capita. And so this was real in 1939 for black voters. And whenever we talk white terrorism, we have to talk black resistance, because Sam Solomon, who led the campaign for black voters in the 1930s in Miami, he was the head of the Negro Service League. It's the song, like, I ain't never scared, right? And so he was like, they showed up, but so did we. And so remember I said 50 people, right? It was the max number of black votes. 50 was the max number of black votes cast in municipal elections pre-1939. The day after the Klan rode through Overtown, this is a photo of black folks voting. The day after the Klan rode through Overtown, some 800 people cast votes. And so part of this work that I'm doing with Black Miami-Dade is unearthing these visuals. It's not that they don't exist, but you probably would not run into them. And again, I have to go back to how Miami markets itself, because tourism is an integral part of Miami's economy from its very founding. Early Miami branded itself as the Magic City. And so as a result of that, and understanding the power of the economy and the tourism economy, it is also the case in Miami that it's not racist here, it's that we can't show people how racist it is. And so much of that is covered up. So Miami is an important site of black resistance in many ways across the South. And so if we're talking about the fight for accommodations to public spaces, one of the first direct action protests for accommodations to public spaces happened in Miami. The reason Black people in Miami got a beach, Virginia Key Beach, which is a historical site that still stands today in Miami, is because there was a wait-in. That wait-in happened years before many of the other wait-ins would happen across the South. And so Miami is a site of resistance around even public accommodations, and that some of the first incidents of direct action as it relates to public accommodations for Black folks happened in Miami. And then as a result of that, Virginia Key Beach was formed, a colored-only beach that saw everyday people, thousands of people would go there. Easter sunrise service happened here. Martin Luther King came here. Sammy Davis Jr. hung out here. This was the site of Black leisure. It was a site of Black rest. It was kind of like an amusement park. There was a carousel for the kids. There were train rides for the kids. The parking lot was always packed because there was a space, and even if it wasn't the best space, even if it wasn't on Miami Beach, this was an important example of a site of resistance for public accommodations or access to public spaces for Black people in the South. Another example of Black resistance in Miami, this is a photo of Congress of Racial Equality. If you are familiar with CORE, CORE is the organization that led much of the lunch counter sit-ins in the late 1950s, 1960s. In 1959, CORE held one of their direct action workshops teaching young Black people and mostly white Jewish allies how they would go into the direct action of the lunch counter sit-ins and how they would do this work. That training happened in Miami at the Sir John Hotel in segregated Miami-Dade. And again, if we think about the impact, right, of the lunch counter sit-ins and the implications of lunch counter sit-ins, Miami as a training site, right, for Black resistance is very true. And this is a photo of one of the lunch counter sit-ins in downtown Miami that was led by CORE. Part of making Black Miami-Dade visible and seeing Black Miami-Dade also is joy, right? And Black entertainment. And so if you look at this photo, this is the Sir John Hotel in Miami. It is no longer standing, but it is one of the premier like luxury hotels for Black folks of the Jim Crow era. And the Sir John Hotel was an interesting space because there would be all kinds of artists, right? And again, back to the tourism mecca, in order for Miami Beach to be a popping spot, even in segregated Miami, it required the best entertainers to perform there at the clubs, at the hotels, and that meant Black entertainers, right? So we're talking about Billie Holiday, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, Aretha Franklin, Sammy Davis Jr. all performed on Miami Beach, but Miami Beach was also a sundown town. And so if you were Black, you could perform there, but you certainly could not stay there. And so after their performances, they had to go to Black Miami. Sir John Hotel is one of the places the performers would go to. And, you know, Black folks from Miami, the elders will share stories about how, well, white people had to pay all this money to go see them. They were just jamming in the lounge for free at the Sir John. So it was a party. But even around head, like entertainer, you will make money from me performing here, but I can actually stay here. Right, and we can certainly echo, you know, the of Black entertainers still today, and some the audio. I'm an audio person. I'm like, what's happening? Sir John Hotel was one of the places. Y'all didn't see that. The Sir John Hotel was one of the places that many of these entertainers would go to. That building is no longer standing. The Mary Elizabeth Hotel, also one of the hotels that they would go to in segregated Black Miami, also a building that's no longer standing. But the historic Hampton House is still standing. It is the only Green Book era hotel in Miami that has been preserved. And the Hampton House, y'all see them, right? Hair done, outfits together. You know, this was a spot. And it was a spot for Black tourists, for Black celebrities. Who's who would be at the Hampton House. The Hampton House is situated in Brownsville, which is not colored town or Overtown as we know it, but it's another segregated area of Miami called Brownsville of that era. This is a photo of Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X at the Hampton House. You may have seen this photo. You may have seen the movie One Night in Miami, but it tells the story, the true story of how Muhammad Ali went from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali at the Hampton House. Martin Luther King used to stay at the Hampton House. It is said that he wrote the first draft of his I Have a Dream speech there. And so the historic Hampton House as a site of just joy, of just pure joy, and also glamour, because I'm here for Black glamour, right? And so the dresses, the baubles, the earrings, and all of the people who would show up and hang out in the lounge and drink and eat and smoke cigarettes and just have a good old time, that space still exists and it's preserved still in Miami. But it's very possible that you have been all up and through Miami and have no idea that such an important space exists around Black history. And in fact, I think the historic Hampton House is the only Green Book 2-story hotel that stands in the entire South. And so part of making this history visible is really putting it front and center and making it plain. Just make it plain that this happened here. Here are the people who were here, and contextualizing the images so you don't have to guess what's happening. And it's part of why I created the Black Miami-Dade platform. And the platform does several things. One, there's a library. Because I think it's important for people to go to the resource where it exists. Because there is a version of learning history where people don't want to share where they learned the information from. And I reject that wholly. I don't think you hoard history. I don't think you hoard information. And so the library includes all of the books that I have read and have found about Miami Black history. So if you feel so inclined, please go read it, right? I have aggregated all of the public videos about Miami Black history on YouTube, so you can find them there. I have aggregated all of the public-facing articles about Miami's Black history, so you can find it under the library. And so in one bucket, this is a resource. It is a resource to know this history, to find it on your own, to dive deeply into it. We have multiple educational institutions in Miami, like FIU, Florida International University, University of Miami, and they've done a number of oral histories with Black folks in Miami. And then those oral histories die behind a .edu link, and you have no idea it's there. And so I point back to where those oral histories are. So if you want to go and listen to the elders tell their stories, you can, because their stories were captured. So it's not that that history isn't there. But for me, it's like, well, how do you make that more visible, and how does it become more shareable so that people for whom it belongs can access it? Another part of the Black Miami-Dade project is reclamation, which Joan kind of mentioned earlier. So I'm really interested in buying Black Miami back where it exists out in the world. And so I have been on this personal quest over the past 3 years to buy back all of the stuff I find about Miami's Black history from the internet, and vintage estate sales, in thrift stores, and people's yard sales, because a lot of this history gets thrown away, or a loved one passes away and it gets tossed out. Or in the case of newspapers, when newspapers digitized, they discarded a lot of their original archives and photos. And so every single one I have found of Black people, I have bought back, because that history belongs to us in Miami. And I bought them back from the most random places, from Memphis, Tennessee to Sussex, England. Right? And I'm like, this is ours. And so I spent a good amount of money buying us back. This is one of the yearbooks I recently added to my personal collection, and it's Richmond Heights Junior High School circa 1976. And I was just like, look at these afros. And I posted it on the Instagram account, and I just love the intergenerational conversations that happen when people see themselves. Somebody came under the comments and was like, that's my daddy, Donald Stringer. And this happens a lot on the Instagram post, where I'll post an image and it's like, that's my mom, that's my great grandma. And then you have someone with intimate experience who then fills in the history even deeper. Or like, that was my pediatrician, and this is what her office looked like. And she used to give us the dum-dum pops, and we used to fall out in her office and she used to just look at us, right? The historical record does not show us that. Right? It is the human stories that fill that in. And so there are these conversations that are happening in the post that I'm still trying to figure out, how do you capture this and save it, right? Around like, I know this person. And also the fact that Miami history is just not celebrities. that Donald Stringer is Miami history, right? That Dorothy Davis, that Dale Owens existing in 1976, that they're Miami history too. And so this comes from my personal collection. This is another image from my personal collection of the colored ward at Mount Sinai Hospital on Miami Beach. We're gonna let that colored ward just sit there, right? Because this is segregated era Miami that this photo comes from. And even though we're dealing with the violence of apartheid Jim Crow in this image, what I see is just pure tenderness, right? This is a mom who had just given birth, and this is a nurse. I'm looking at the way she's touching her shoulders and the smile on her face, like, good job, mom, right? And it's just such a sweet image. And these are not the type of images you see about Black folks. We typically see us in distress. We see us when our neighborhoods are on fire. We see us when we are the victims of violence, but we don't see like this tenderness in the historical images about Miami front and center in the same way. And this last image is a Haitian protest, and I'm Haitian, so I'm just here for his face. Because it just says everything you need to know, right? And this is part of seeing us, right? Because who does not have an uncle who has not hit this stance at least once, right? But I think, you know, in looking at the photo, like you can kind of fill in like how he's feeling, right? We really about to walk down these streets, but we got to. And here's the thing around like Miami and the layered histories of Miami around Blackness. If you want to understand the mass detention system of immigrants in the US, you have to understand Haitian migration. Because up until the US saw hundreds, thousands of Black immigrants coming in waves by boat to Miami, the policy was not catch and detain. The whole detention system that we understand today was built and perfected on Haitians who migrated to Miami. And so you had the Chrome Detention Center, which is pretty much a jail that holds immigrants, right? And so Black immigrants in Miami, Black Haitian immigrants in particular, was the group that this practice of mass detention happened on, and it only perfected over time to the system that we know today. And so Miami is a site for Black immigrant rights. Miami as a site of detention of immigrants to understand nationally how we deal with immigrants, what it means to be unwanted, and what is happening in the border, right? That these are all threads that you can actually trace back to Black folks in Miami, in particular Black immigrants in Miami, the Haitian community. And I actually have over a dozen images that I have rescued and repatriated back to Miami on Haitian existence as well. So I come from a journalism background, and one of the things as a journalist that used to irk my editors, but thrilled the ones that really knew what they were doing, was always asking, like, okay, yeah, this is the story, but what don't we see? Like, what histories, like, what's missing? Like, who are we not talking to, right? That can be very drawn out, but I'm very curious in that way when I'm interrogating the stories I tell, but even interrogating the archives, like, what can we see and make visible, but what haven't we seen and aren't making visible, and why? And so as a Black queer woman from Miami, I have been really thinking about, where's the Black queer history? Because there's lots written about LGBTQ plus history in Florida and in Miami, and it's very white. And so it is white memory. There is no memory around queerness and Blackness that is really central and centralized and made visible beyond sometimes maybe an aside. Every now and then there might be an exhibit, and if you squint really hard, you might see a Black person in the audience, or there's a drag queen performing for a Black drag queen performing for a largely white audience, but we don't get to really explore any deeper than that, right? And so part of this exhibit that I'm working on for the spring is really interrogating Black queerness in Miami. And so these two lines actually come from the Miami Times, which is the oldest Black newspaper in the South, and it's the largest Black newspaper in the South, and is still based in Miami. And one of the things that I have been doing to find this history is to layer between 1950 and the mid-1960s. Florida lost its mind, still has lost its mind, but in particular around queerness. And so this is the moment where, it's called the homosexual panic, right? The homosexual mania, like the gay people are here. We have to raid the bars. We have to raid all gathering spaces where gay people gather. And so you saw the Klan going into gay bars, the morality police, which is the actual police. So the Klan and the police, which was very indistinguishable because the Klan was members of the police and the police were members of the Klan. But many of that was in predominantly white spaces. But there was no question for me. I'm like, if this is happening in white spaces, it had to have been happening in black spaces too. And so I layered that time frame and was able to find, of course, in the black newspaper, in the court reports, because they would record what was happening in the Negro court, because the courts were also segregated. And so if you're looking for queer arrests in Miami and you just go through the general court, you have to account for the fact that the general court was a segregated court. It was whites only. There was a separate court for black people. And so by going through that, I was able to find incidents of queerness and queerness being criminalized in Black Miami. And so the first strip you see it was actually an accounting of Essie Mae Calloway, someone who had clearly chosen a name that was a feminine name and who clearly, based off the reporting, lived as a woman, but is consistently referred to as a man and an obvious homosexual. I low-key want to put that on a shirt, though, an obvious homosexual. And then the second strip is around another defendant in the black courts who was sentenced to 40 days for the crime of being a homosexual. And there are a number of examples where people were being sentenced within that same time period between the 1950s and 60s for being gay, for being lewd, which just was code for being gay, for having gay sex, for existing in queerness. And at the same time, as is always the case, even though you had the state violence attacking black queerness, you also had safety in the black community. This is a drag show that happened in Black Miami. When I found this ad, and it was actually a fellow archivist librarian of the Miami-Dade Public Library System who pointed me to this and was like, dig deeper still. And this is why I love librarians. I will always be a fangirl of the public library system. And my little heart, I was just like, there were drag queens in Overtown in the 1950s, right? This is not something, and I'm from Miami and had no clue. And there are some key indicators around just queerness and queer history. October 31st has always been a very important date if you are a queer person, because it was a safe day to dress as you felt, right? And maybe would not be attacked in the same way as you would if maybe it was August 1st. And so on Halloween is when you would have these enormous masquerade balls where drag queens would come from different parts of the South to perform in Miami in these epic shows in the black community. And I think it's really interesting to see that this was hosted by Clyde Killens, because Clyde Killens was a premier promoter in Miami. Clyde claims he taught Dionne Warwick how to sashay across the stage. He was like, "You doing it wrong." But he was the promoter of Black Miami. And so to see that he was also promoting these drag shows also indicates that the club space was a safe space for queerness in Black Miami.
And did that keep going, that safe space, beyond that time? Or?
We will talk about that. Another person who I absolutely adore, when I found him in the archives. And I didn't know that I had an image of him in the ephemera that I collected. So it was really interesting. I was like, we were meant to meet, is Phil Harris. And so I have this old pamphlet of a show that played at the Coconut Grove Playhouse where he was an actor in the show. This is long before I knew he was connected in any way to the research I was doing on Black queerness. And then his name came up in an article that I read, and I posted about him. And then his friends from Miami started responding underneath the post. And there's someone who was like, I used to go to the clubs and we used to love Phil. Phil was a sought after MC in Black Miami. So he used to host a number of shows. He came to Miami in 1946 from New York. He was a trained dancer. He trained with the Catherine Dunham Dance Company. He was an actor. He brought the first Black chorus line to Miami. And he would choreograph these like epic variety shows. And the folks would then perform, but he would also just MC a lot of the shows. And she said that one of his favorite things at every club, wherever he's performing, he would always say, I love the life I live and I live the life I love. And I was like, what a beautiful way to sum up, you know, just being. And he was very open in his queerness, mascara, eyeliner, and he would troll and crack jokes in the audience. The women would get, you know, they're like, you know, chill, Phil, like my husband don't play like that. And his response would be like, well, tell him to get his drawers out my bedroom. Right? And so Phil clearly took up space in big ways in Black Miami and was loved and was sought after, right? And so this is another example of just Black queerness existing in Miami, in particular in the club scene, which makes sense because when we think about what the club means to queer folks in particular, it has always been home and a space of safety as well. So as part of making visible, I love to reimagine and think through, like, what happens if we position Miami as a Black queer space, because it is. And so Josephine Baker is one of the people who would perform on Miami Beach but could not stay there. She is a whole bisexual icon. And so I have commissioned an artist, Kendrick Day, who is actually based here in New York, but is from Miami. He's from Coconut Grove, a Black gay artist. And for the show, he's creating these beautiful collages. Kendrick is a collage artist. He created Black Queer Tarot, which is a tarot deck. And he plays a lot with like these intergalactic, beautiful, almost outer space-like images. And so he's creating these collages for the exhibit that will center Josephine Baker, who made history in Miami in desegregating for the first time an audience on Miami Beach. When she came to perform, or when they asked her to perform, she said, absolutely not. I will not perform on Miami Beach because this is the Jim Crow Deep South, and I will not perform in an audience where I don't see Black people. And they wanted her badly enough that she was able to get them to rewrite that contract to make sure that this was an integrated audience. And it was clear that Ms. Baker did not have much trust in the promoters because she also made them buy plane tickets for her Black friends to come in case there was some funny business that stopped the locals from coming. She brought her squad with her to come see her show. Because she's like, when I perform, I want to see Black faces in the audience, right? And that happened on Miami Beach. Stormy de la Reverie, most people know Stormy from Stonewall. Most people know Stormy from being, it is said, the Black woman who threw one of the first punches that would kick off what was known as the modern gay rights movement. Stormy lived in Miami long before Stonewall. She lived in Miami in the 1950s, and she performed at the Jewel Box Review, which was a very queer space of female impersonators, all white female impersonators, and Stormy, a drag king, a male impersonator, as they were called back then. And they performed everywhere, including the Apollo here in New York, right? But Stormy got her start as a male impersonator in Miami. And much of her connections to Miami in the historical record are not really visible. And so it's like repositioning Miami as a place where Stormy lived and performed and took up space as well. And so this is gonna be part of the collage work that Kendrick is working on. And the last image I'm going to show you before we open it up for a Q&A is Naomi Ruth Cobb. You know, y'all might know Liberty City because of the City Girls, but I call Dr. Naomi Cobb the original City Girl. She's from Liberty City, and she is a Black lesbian woman who grew up in segregated Miami, behind a segregation wall. And so so for this exhibit, this is a portrait of Naomi that was taken by Vanessa Charlot, who is a prolific, brilliant photographer from Miami who I was able to commission because these images, this is the first preview of one of the images that was taken for the exhibit. And I spent hours talking to Dr. Cobb and just talking about queerness growing up in Miami and all that she has seen and experienced and the layers of that, right? Having a dad who ultimately passed away when she was a teen because he could not be put on the dialysis machine because they didn't put Black people on those machines in the white hospital. And to also experience what it was like to have a segregation wall because the white community on the other side of that wall did not want your community to be built. And so a giant wall was built to block them. But on the other side of that wall, Dr. Cobb shared stories around seeing Black queerness and it being safety. Because if it wasn't safe on the side of the wall where the white folks were, it had to be safe on this side. And so she talked about her friend who had 2 moms. She talked about seeing 2 girls kiss for the first time, her neighbors, when she was at their house. She talked about playing house with other little girls in the neighborhood, right? And one of the stories that she shared with me that I absolutely loved was about the tailor. And most Black neighborhoods have a queer tailor who makes the clothes. And she was like, growing up at first, you know, the tailor was referred to as he mostly, but it was clear like he would wear earrings, sometimes he would wear lipstick, but over time, this tailor would present more feminine and just start wearing women's clothes and would only wear women's clothes. And at some point, she said, my mom just stopped calling him he and started calling him she. There was no big announcement. It just made sense. And that's a layer of Miami's Black history that you just will not see. And so I'm interested in the interiority of our stories. What does it look like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like? Who is making the clothes in a way that the historical record does not account for. And so that's what these oral histories are doing, and that's what this research is doing. And the curtain raiser of that research is this exhibit, but long term, there will be more and deeper research on Black queerness in Miami that will focus on the younger generation as well. So I will stop there. And just thank y'all, because this project really, for me, is a project that is a love project. It is a community love project. Everyone who knows me knows I love Miami. I love Black people. I love Black people in Miami. And you know, the whole idea of a village, I was raised by a village of Black folks in Miami, intergenerational village, multicultural village of Black folks, Haitians, Americans, Jamaicans, like they were all of them raised me, right? And so I think if a community loves you, you have to love them back. And so this is my love offering back to a community that I absolutely love. And you know, people who aren't part of that community can take part as well. But this is for them. This is why I do this work. And now I will open it up to questions.
Thank you. What are the dates for your exhibit again?
Good question. The exhibit is going to be in March. The exact opening date is TBD, but definitely it kicks off in March. It'll be up for about a month at the Little Haiti Cultural Center. I will definitely share those dates on Black Miami-Dade platform, and I will certainly share it with the center here so that they can, you know, let you know. But if you come sometime in the middle of March, it'll be up. But if you want to come for opening day, you have to wait for the exact date because I don't know that one yet.
Thank you.
Nadege, we're inviting in our online audience, so if there are questions from the Q&A, Carissa will field them to you.
Awesome. Yes, if you have questions online, please ask them as well. Yes, Noland.
A name. Hello. My question is, did you start collecting things and then the project came to you, or was the other way around? What came first, the chicken or the egg?
I don't even know, because I honestly feel like this is just building off of the work I've already done. Like, even as a journalist, like, my happy place was always the historical stories. The last piece I did for our local NPR station before I left was the history of a Black neighborhood that was completely eradicated because the white neighbors didn't want them there no more. And the school board was the one that evicted the folks in that neighborhood, and the county and the city. But one of the little girls who was evicted from that neighborhood now sits on the school board that evicted her. Yes. Dr. Dorothy Bendross Mendengal. And so I got to sit with that. And so I think, like, that has always been a part of. But when I left journalism full time, I knew I wanted to focus on this. I knew I wanted to do this. I didn't know how it would. So I don't know, Noah. I think the Black Miami-Dade project came first, ish. Yes, Joe.
I wanted to know if you could. I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about how your skill sets, how you think your skill sets as a journalist and a writer inform your work as an archivist.
I think for me, it's accessibility. Being a journalist, like the thing that they always tell you, having covered budget meetings, my background is like municipal government reporting, which is very dense, right? And sitting through hours-long budget meetings and crunching all of that stuff. So it's really like, how do you make it plain, right? After you like sit through these like long government-ease, legalese conversations, how do you explain it to everyday people that this thing impacts you, no matter how boring this thing may at first appear. And so I think having that skill around just the analysis on how to make language plain and accessible is super helpful on this front. And also the investigative skills, because investigative reporting was a big part of what I did, except this time I'm not uncovering political corruption in Miami in the same way, but I am, right, in the archives, uncovering some things. But I think that like that curiosity and not like minding to dig through lots of papers, like that's fun for me, right? It's like a puzzle. And then like when the puzzle comes together, you're like, oh snap. And sometimes that puzzle doesn't come together until way later. Like in the case of Phil Harris, I had this image of him and had no idea who he was. And then like cross-reference that with something. And so I go down these black holes. My girlfriend, who was just sitting right here, she laughed. She was like, you do this for fun? You know, she's like, this is fun. I'm like, because like I don't even hear you when I'm going down my black holes. And so I definitely think like the research part of investigative reporting and having like digging through public records as an investigative reporter certainly helps for the hours of just reading that you have to do because you don't know what you're going to find sometimes, and then you just find it. So I think those are the two things.
So another, I have had private friend conversations and colleagues conversations about this, but I want you to talk about the opposite, how the work of the archives and the work of archivists can inform and can help us journalists tell better stories. Yeah,
Brenda's like my sister. I didn't plant her here though. But like she knows, we have talked about this a lot, which is, you know, sometimes we write from a perspective as if you just discovered this thing or like people just landed here. And I'm like, they've been here, right? And so like when we talk about gentrification in Miami, you have to understand the history of Black Miami to understand displacement, because when the Interstate 95 was built, Black folks were displaced from Overtown, this neighborhood that you saw, the same neighborhood where all that voting happened, the same neighborhood that the Klan rode through, the same neighborhood that was considered the Harlem of the South. As in so many other Black spaces, I-95 came through the highway and completely decimated this community, right? And so if you're gonna talk about displacement in Miami, you have to have some reference around the continual displacement of Black folks in Miami and the implications of that, in particular, like if it's something that's a FDOT project or whatever thing that is coming up to now move Black folks, right? So yeah, I always, you know, for reporters, I'm always like, did you even read your own newspaper archives? Like, you know, before you write something, you should, like, you know, look up your own newspaper archives, because that will, you know, fill in some holes that you might not have the reference for, which is fine because you're not from the place maybe, or you're new to covering a particular issue. But I think all journalists should spend time with history and should take history courses and archival courses and really like orient journalism and history, because there is a way that we are talked about in the news that makes it sound like, oh, they just got, or my favorite one in Miami is like, the tech folks are coming here, they're pioneers of this place. And I'm like, gasp. I'm like, really? They just got here. And I was like, but what does it mean for all the pioneers that we know are actually from this space? Like, they're gonna make Miami better. I'm like, this man made Miami better. And y'all don't even have his name anywhere. right? Like, we don't even know his name, right? The people who built Miami. So when people throw words around like pioneer, I'm like, but who are you erasing in that? And so I think journalists interrogating archives and interrogating the history of the space that they're reporting from is very important.
Hi, thank you so much for presenting, researching, loving this community in this way. I'm curious what your archive is. So like, were you told these stories when you were younger? And if so, like, what did that smell like, feel like, taste like you were saying?
Absolutely. I think for me, definitely some living memory, because like I love like my elders. And I'm like, I call myself Mrs. Still Your Grandma, because I was like, I'm gonna make friends with your grandma. You're like, why are you here? I'm like, your grandma told me to come over, you know, like, cause I'm the sweet friend who is like, you know, have manners, and you know, I'm like, what you need, Miss So and So? Like, you need a ride to Walmart? Like, I've always been that friend, and so because of that, I always heard their stories and talked to them, and so I think a lot of it is like just hearing the living museums that are all around us. And also in middle school, I had the absolute honor of being part of this middle school program. There is an institution called the Black Archives, History and Research Foundation in Miami that was founded by Black historian Dr. Dorothy Jenkins Fields. And when I was in middle school, they had like almost like a docent program. And so we were doing oral histories in middle school. We were giving tours of some of the historic Black spaces of Miami, the Chapman House, which is a historic house that was preserved by Dr. Fields. We got to give people tours of that house. I didn't realize back then how important, you know, like that was, but I really got a master class in Black Miami history by a foundational historian of Miami history, right, in middle school. So I think all of that helped shaped how I come into history and understand history. I also grew up in the library system because it was like free babysitting services. So my mom would be like, go to the library, I gotta go to work. So I spent every Saturday at the library for much of my elementary to middle school age years. Miss Shanita, my librarian, is still a friend today. And I just want to note, my librarian was Black, and she was a fashion icon. She had the Janet Jackson braids. She had acrylic nails out to here. I'm pretty sure Miss Shanita had one gold tooth. And so I remember thinking like, I want to grow up and look like Miss Shanita. I was like, can I get braids like this? And like, no, you can't have blonde braids. You're too young, right? But like, I remember she was just like so magical to me. And she would like always point me to different books. And she was the one who told me that there was a main library downtown with even more books, and told me how to get there on the bus, because I had outgrown her library at some point, because she was just having to order the things in for me. And when I got there, it was like that Cinderella moment when you saw all the books like that go from the ground to the ceiling. Like, you know, and she was that for me, right? And so I've always been surrounded, I think, by these pillars and humans who hold this history and who shared this history. I'm also a talkative kid to adults. I didn't really much like talking to people my age, but I love talking to adults. And so, and still today, like, I'm like, I want to talk to your grandma. I'm like, you're not that interesting. And because that's where all the stories are. And so I think I've always been drawn to stories and narratives, even as a young person. And so that, I think, is like the early formation of my obsession with knowing these histories, is just like this natural curiosity and older folks who will entertain me.
Hi, I really enjoyed your lecture. I'm wondering, as you buy back older pieces of history, if you also archive things that are happening right now in terms of the way that we see, you know, history always repeating itself, you know, in our communities and the way that they're affected. And also, if you have a specific vision for how you see your archive growing and affecting and changing in the future as well.
Multi-layered questions. When eventually, right, I don't want to keep this stuff, so I'm going to have to figure out a public institution to turn it over to. People are always like, when are you going to make a museum? I'm like, I don't want a museum. Now, 20 years from now, y'all might be like, I thought you said you didn't want a museum. But for now, I think I'm really interested in really, how do you teach this history and make it available in easy ways? And so in the new year, I'm going to be building out a library of zines that'll be free and downloadable and digital and like really nice, and hire artists to make them. Because again, everyone's not gonna sit down and read these really hard hitting and important like books that are 400 pages, because most of what is written about our history are academic texts and are published by academic presses, which means that they're not for early learning. They're not even for K through 12. You know, this is like college level reading, which is great, but I don't think the only people who should have access to our history should be people in college. And so I'm really interested in making, and I also collect like zines from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Black zines, Black queer zines, and I'm obsessed. I'm like, all you need is some paper and some staples, let's go, right? And so while there will be like, you know, digital versions as well, I also recognize a digital divide in our communities, that just because you have a phone don't mean you use it this way, right? I'm a super user, right? But, you know, if you don't have a good plan, if you don't have a good data plan, if your phone gets disconnected every other month because you can't make it, and then Metro PCS gives you a new number, like there are a lot of other ways, right, that we use phones and access phones, and that's real. So just making sure that there are also like tactile versions, right? Like things that you can touch and print out and give to people is what I'm interested in. And I think there was another part of your question. Did I get it all? Okay.
We have a couple of questions from the online audience, and I really hope I say this person's name correctly. I think you might know them, so you can please correct me. Yindia Lorick Wilmot. She says, Nadege, I'm looking forward to recording with you for my podcast this spring. In the meantime, I'm curious to know what has been the most surprising / transformational story you've uncovered to date. And then she also wants to ask, what does Nadege want the legacy of this project to be, and how does she hope this project will show up in the archive in the future?
I mean, I'm constantly being wowed by the information, honestly. I don't think there's like one thing that I can say. I'm obsessed with, okay, my girlfriend said I'm lying. What wowed me?
Currently 1918.
Oh, 1918, okay, yeah. She's like, you were wild last week. Oh my gosh, yeah, 1918, I was really excited, y'all. So I found, I'm not gonna tell you what I found about 1918 because I'm gonna do something with it. Just kidding. But it's something really cool. More to come on that. But I will say, some of the things that have really excited me has been around Black healing. I come from a lineage of Black healers from Haiti, and so the way we use plant medicine, the way, and sometimes the archives, if you are Caribbean, you're familiar with Cerasi. If you speak Creole, it's called Associ. It is the most bitter thing ever, but it will heal you, okay? Like you will be healed. And so it was really interesting looking at old Black Miami, and even in the archives, the way plant medicine shows up, especially around midwifery, especially after the 1918 Spanish flu. There was a really interesting, it was like 2 lines where this white woman had asked one of the Black caretakers in her home if they would share like the little poultice stuff that they were wearing, because it felt like the Black people weren't getting sick because they were wearing these chains made with different plants. And so she was like, can I get one of those? And so I love the way that we use plant medicine as a diaspora. And so anytime I see things about plants and healing, that is always really cool. And it's not necessarily reflected in the Black Miami-Dade work yet. And And I love dancers. I come from a dance background. I'm a classically trained dancer. So every time I see a dancer in the archives, I'm just like, come on, Tally Beatty in Miami. Come on, Catherine Dunham in Miami. So I just love to see dancers or hear about the ballet classes that were happening in the 1950s, or the modern dance classes in the charm schools, and, learning how to walk. I'm obsessed with fashion. So all of the fashion shows and the fashion designers like LaTanya, who would come to Miami and put on fashion shows, those are the things that delight me, because those are the things that are I rarely see around the history. So those are a few of the things. And the legacy, I think the legacy is just pure infiltration, right? That people who have people will have this information and be able to share it. I do not want to be a teacher. And I'm not a teacher, right? So I don't plan on going to school and teaching kids in that way. But teachers should be able to access this information, be able to teach it, right? After school programs should be able to access this information and teach it, and that's how you reach the most amount of people. So I'm really interested around what building a curriculum looks like, what continuing to build public memory and public events that bring in those intergenerational conversations, so that we're not talking about people, but we're talking with them. Because many of the folks I'm referencing from the 1950s and 60s, they're still here. Right, Miami Herald, the first Black reporter they ever hired, first Black woman reporter, Bee Hines, is my friend. I worked with Bee at the Miami Herald, right? This iconic figure, this historical figure. A lot of the folks who are part of CORE, they're still here. And so what does it mean to bring in these intergenerational conversations and to have them teach their history, because it's theirs, right? And so I would love to create a speakers bureau of Black Miami folks who could just share their part of the history. And so I'm really interested in how do you get the people with people to know this history so that they can pass it on? How do you get artists to know this history so that they can create from it and build on it? That's what I want to do. Because I don't want to go in and I don't think it's the most effective way to just go in and do a lecture and then go away, especially within the community. You need someone who's going to stay with it, right? And all the things that it brings up, and to process that and to build from that. And so that's what I'm interested in. And I hope that will be a legacy that lives beyond me, because as one of my friends, Aaron Jackson, said, who's a local photographer, can't just be one or two or three or four or five people. You need an army of storytellers. And so I'm interested in building that army and arming them.
Great. We're kind of running out of time. There's a couple of more questions from people online that I think might be pretty fast to answer. They're kind of related. There is someone working on a project archiving Black Miami and uncovering their personal family's history as a 19-year-old being from Coconut Grove. Its current gentrification is something that I really want to look into, and just asking if you have any advice for someone pursuing a project like that.
Email me, blackmiamidade@gmail.com.
Great, there you go, loveblue10. Yeah, and you can email the Eventbrite to person. And then the second one, this will be our last one. Would you consider publishing an anthology of all the stories you are collecting about both Black and queer lives?
Yes.
Thank you so much for bringing this to this community too, because it's amazing how little Miami knows about its history, but to spread it is also incredibly important. And having just been in Miami for the art week and the book fair week, and I'm curious. There are a lot of emerging Black artists, in particular writers and dancers and musicians, and I'm curious how you are able to incorporate that community, the artist community, into your work, or how you might want to be doing that going forward.
I'm curious on how they'll incorporate me into their archives, right? Because they're already doing the work. I mean, again, Black folks have been here in Miami, and so, I mean, the dance history in Miami is deep. The African Heritage Cultural Arts Center, you know, people may know it because of Moonlight, but like that has always been a space, a very important space around Black arts in Miami. So much Black artists come from that space, but I'm really interested in like how do you archive Miami's Black arts history? Even during the Black arts movement, during the Civil Rights movement, you had a lot happening in Miami, and many of those folks, like Jean Tinney, is very much still alive and still here. And they created like their art collective out of the University of Miami. And so you have this history here. I'm curious around like, what would it look like around Miami Art Week to actually focus on Miami's Black arts, right? Local, or Miami Black arts history. Because if you look, you know, Black arts, the Black arts movement, you'll find some really dope stuff, right? You'll find Afro-Cobra, you'll find some really dope things that are situated in very specific places, right? Mostly the Northeast. You will not find much about Miami's Black arts roots, and that is a shame, because it's so deep and it's so layered. And so I would be really curious around like if Miami cares about investing in artists, what it means to invest in preserving the histories of the Black artists who had been here and who are still here and who will be here in the future. And I'm happy to help with that. But again, I don't think like this is like, I don't have to do all of this, right? Like we have arts institutions all over Miami. So what would it look like for them to invest in that? Because there's a version of this where we like labor Black women who are doing the work to do even more work. And I do not aspire to labor, right? And so I don't think like it's one person's to carry, but like what does it look like to help other people carry this work? I'm really interested in how to do that.
So that was our last question. And again, I'd like us to give Nadege a rousing, warm round of applause. And thank you. Nadege, on behalf of Deb Willis and myself, this was really soul food. I really couldn't think of a better way to end our speaker series for the fall. These images are just so rich and so grounding and so rooting while simultaneously being inspiring. So we can't, you know, we are sending you off in the world to do more. Please know that you always have a home at the center. Keep us informed, let us know. You know I'll bug you anyway, but let us know, let the larger community know. And again, thank you so much for sharing your time and your semester with us. This has been beautiful. And thank you to our audience again. That wine and food is not going to eat and drink itself, so please don't be shy. If you would like a little more, please take a little more or a lot more. And have a good evening.